The topic of this panel discussion is extremely important, and that's because the choices that BRICS, as large societies which are undergoing many kinds of transformations, will actually determine collectively whether an alternative global future is possible. And these choices would hopefully provide lessons for all countries, including how developed countries must alter their current economic patterns and lifestyles. And accordingly, I think it deserves a serious rather than a politically correct answer. And in my experience, politically correct answers have a tendency to be misleading and often very little operational content. So I apologize in advance if my argument is a little dense and technical, but that's how it is. I want to cut through the verbiage about the whole issue of sustainability. I will rely on a conceptual framework by Georgescu Rongen. As you know, that in his name an award has been instituted in this year's DSDS. And briefly it goes like this. All organized systems, whether they are living organisms, industrial plant, consumer goods, economic, societal and political systems, represent order rather than chaos. And formally stated, they have low entropy, which is the physicist's measure of disorder in the universe. Getting to this low state of entropy, however, requires inputs from the external environment and the generation of waste, which goes back to the environment and which embodies disorder or high entropy. And the net entropy of the system and the environment taken together increases in the process. This is an iron law of nature called the second law of thermodynamics. A state of development in a given society would be characterized by lower entropy than a state of underdevelopment. No matter how we try to define development, it always boils down to this. We're speaking of a greater state of order as compared to a state of disorder. And maintaining the state would require constant inputs of energy, which would be higher if the same society were to remain underdeveloped. And further, if the society is transiting from a state of lower development to a higher one, this would require inputs of energy to reduce the entropy of the society. Thus, the development process itself requires energy, and this incremental requirement of energy, if the rate of development is rapid enough, may require higher levels of energy inputs than when the society reaches a steady developed state. Now, let me clarify here. I'm not speaking of entropy and energy in some metaphorical sense. The terms are being used in exactly the same sense as used in physics. And thus, the process of development, howsoever defined, would involve creation of infrastructure, productive capital, technology, knowledge, skills, housing, and economic, regulatory, and governance institutions, and it will always involve increasing use of energy. Now, a couple of aspects have to be noted. First, that while increasing energy in general accompanies increasing well-being, this relationship is not monotonic and not one-to-one. For example, an overweight person has less entropy than a thin person, consumes more food energy, has used more food accumulating fat, but does not have the greater level of well-being. Second, that the high entropy discharged as waste matters for human well-being, but it is not simply the aggregate of entropy introduced into the environment that matters, but also the specific material form in which the entropy is embodied. The sulfur dioxide discharged from a power plant may have less entropy than fly ash discharged from the same power plant, but its negative impact on well-being is probably much higher. How does this relate to the topic? First, that talking of delinking development from increasing energy use is essentially scientific nonsense. Second, that societal choices of how exactly the low entropy system is configured, by which I mean the actual consumer choices and the production of trading or governance systems by which these consumer choices are satisfied, matters for overall well-being. Third, that while increasing waste generation is inevitable, societies could make well-being enhancing choices in the specific material form in which the entropy in the waste is embodied, and this would also constitute choices in the energy forms that they employ. Coal will give off CO2, which will cause climate change. Renewables will generate low-grade heat, which will eventually be dispersed harmlessly into space by natural processes. However, there is an important caveat. Energy choices in themselves represent claims on society's resources, and these resources could otherwise enhance well-being. If you spend more money on renewables as opposed to coal, you will gain in well-being from less harmful entropy as waste, but you may lose more in that the extra money spent on renewables may mean less food or schooling. So what are the lessons? First and foremost, the critical importance of responsible consumer choices worldwide, not just in the BRICS, not just in the developing countries, not just in the developed countries. What kind of choices are we talking about? Do not eat red meat, recycle everything, use public transport, live in dense cities with mixed land use and not suburbia. If the BRICS alone were to make responsible consumer choices, but the OECD does not, the OECD will simply import its polluting goods from the former, and this is in fact what is happening. Second, the importance of technological development on both consumption and production choices, including energy technologies, to enable responsible societal choices. This will require concerted global efforts on R&D and transfer of technologies across economies in ways that do not result in decrease in well-being to any society. So, how are the BRICS doing? In the 4 Green Dex reports on consumption patterns prepared by the National Geographic, between 2008 and 2012, annually they are prepared for 17 large countries. India has consistently been number 1. Brazil has tied once with India for number 1, and together with China, they have alternated among the 2nd and the 3rd places. Russia has consistently done better than Germany and all the other EU countries, not to speak of the US, since 2009. So then how does one explain Russia and China's apparently high intensity of energy use? I would explain this by looking at their trading patterns of producing fossil energy, industrial materials, and consumption goods for Western markets, rather than looking at their own levels or patterns of consumption. Thus, a Stockholm Environment Institute report of 2011 concluded that while the EU has brought down the aggregate emissions within its borders, its CO2 intensity of consumption has not reduced. And this CO2 intensive consumption has simply been imported from Russia and China. Finally, how are the BRICS doing on clean energy? China is now the global leader in manufacture of renewable energy technology and equipment and deployment rates. Asia as a whole last year accounted for more than 50% of renewables investments worldwide. Brazil is the global champion in the use of biofuels. And what about India? India has invested in developing the mother of all clean technologies, the 3-stage nuclear cycle, which is inherently safe and enables the world as a whole to use its virtually limitless thorium resources, which can fully replace coal worldwide in the space of the next 3 decades. Also, day before yesterday, on the first day of the DSDS, we had newspapers handed out to us. Even today we have them. We have the Hindu Business Line. And there was a report in the Hindu Business Line of day before yesterday, which revealed that in the new round of bids for solar power in Tamil Nadu, this has yielded an asking tariff of rupees 5.97 a unit. That's about 11 cents. That's the lowest in the world. It's nearly on par with the grid average. It has been accomplished in just 3 years of Indian regulatory and tariff policy on renewables. So the BRICS are doing fine, but the BRICS have a number of lessons the world has to sit up and take notice. Thank you.